Undoubtedly, serial killers can be considered one of the nightmares of people all over the world. Some serial murders are hidden by the government, but many serial killers have been in the media headlines for a long time. Always, when talking about murder and crime, a mixture of horror and disgust fills the whole being, but subconsciously, with the stimulation of curiosity, the question is formed in the mind. Who is willing to do it and for what reason? Commit such a crime? Maybe that's why the pages of newspaper events are so popular and popular. Such people are usually sick people who enjoy killing. Even some of them do very horrible things and crimes to get more pleasure, such as rape, eating body parts, eating blood, strange dead worshippers and more strange things, of which there are many examples in the crime files of all countries. The most famous and most feared serial killers usually have motivations other than financial issues, and for this reason, the most terrible and worst murders in the world are committed by people whom no one would even suspect. Here we mention some examples of the most dangerous murders in the world, which are in some ways very terrible. Jack the Ripper. He was known as Jack the Ripper, but no one knows who was one of the oldest and most notorious killers. This killer appeared in the Whitechapel area of London in 1888 and killed 5 women, all prostitutes, and mutilated their bodies. The police speculated that the killer was a surgeon, butcher, or someone skilled with a scalpel. The killer mocked the society and the police by sending letters in which he showed how to do all the murders. Although many suspects were named over the years, the killer was never identified. John Wayne Gacy. He was nicknamed the Killer Clown for his work at children's birthday parties and charity events as Pogo the Clown. His job gave him easy access to potential victims. Gacy was convicted of raping, torturing and murdering 33 teenage boys in a 6-year period. He would drag those children to his house, kill them by suffocation, then bury them in his house. Gacy was executed in 1994. Abul Qasim Jabbar, the most famous murderer of Afghanistan. Abul Qasim Jabbar, the most dangerous Afghan killer, chose his victims mainly from among men and boys. During his arrest, he was suspected of the massacre of 300 men and boys. In terms of crimes against humanity, he does not have the least of the terrorist forces of the Taliban. Unfortunately, before the arrest of Abul Qasim Jabbar, the then government of Afghanistan executed 2 people for the murders he had committed. He was arrested in 1970 and confessed to many murders. Fortunately, this serial killer was not sentenced to life imprisonment like some of his colleagues and spent only 1 year in prison. Abul Qasim Jabbar was hanged in 1971. Yang Xinhai. This time we go to a serial killer from China. Yang Xinhai has committed the most murders among the serial killers of China and its surroundings, and thus has earned the title of the most prolific serial killer in this country. He has been accused of 65 murders and more than 23 rapes that took place between 1999 and 2003. He enters houses at night and commits murders with cold weapons such as axes and hammers. Despite his confession to 65 murders, the police managed to trace Yang Xinhai to 67 murders. He, who was arrested in 2003 and executed in 2004, said in his confession, "The more people he kills, the more he wants to kill people." He was an antisocial person and it seems that he was arrested a little late like the Afghan killer. Kampathimar Shankaria. Kampathimar Shankaria was an Indian serial killer who was linked to more than 70 murders by the police. He started his murders in 1977 and was arrested 2 years later, in 1979. He used a hammer to kill and kills all his victims with hammer blows to the head. Kampathimar Shankaria had told the police that he enjoyed his murders. His famous sentence at the time of execution was, "You are killing me for nothing, I hope this doesn't happen to anyone else." Gary Ridgway. In the first part, most of the killers were from Asian countries. But in this case, we will go to a dangerous American killer. Gary Ridgway, also known as Green River, committed most of his crimes between the 1980s and 1990s. It is interesting to note that Gary Ridgway chose his victims from street women or the so-called sleeping cartons, so that he would be the least important in society and no one would worry about their absence. Most of his murders were suffocated and then their bodies were left in the forest. At first, Gary Ridgway approached these women and started talking to them. He then gains their sympathy by showing them a photo of his son. In the next step, he kills these women. Although Gary Ridgway had confessed to 71 murders, the police believed that Gary Ridgway's number of murders was higher. Pedro Filo. Pedro Filo was a serial killer born in Brazil. When Pedro's mother was pregnant with him, she was abused by her husband, and as a result of the beatings, Pedro was born with a damaged skull. At the age of 13, Pedro's father pushed him under a crane with the intention of killing him, and he survived the accident. At the age of 14, Pedro Filo kills the deputy mayor because his father fired him for theft. His second murder takes place at the same time, the person who seemed to be the main thief. After fleeing due to the murders, Pedro Filo settles in another city. After the murder of a drug trafficker, he meets a woman named Maria, but the woman he loves is killed by a drug mafia group. After that, Pedro Filo went after the members of this gang, and after torturing them, he tried to kill them. This was while he was under 20 years old. After that, the father kills his parents. Pedro goes to his father for revenge and kills him too. He also committed murder in prison and killed 71 people during his 30-year sentence. Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Daniel Camargo Barbosa is undoubtedly one of the dirtiest and most hated serial killers in the world. During the years 1970 to 1980, he kidnapped more than 150 young women and girls, raped them and then tried to kill them. He is accused of having committed numerous murders and rapes in Colombia and Ecuador over the course of 12 years. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was first imprisoned in 1974 after killing a 9-year-old girl. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. However, Camargo escaped from prison but was re-arrested in 1986. When he escaped from prison, he committed many murders. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez, who was also called the Monster of the Andes, was a man with an ugly face. This evil murderer was accused of sexually harassing and murdering more than 300 young girls. His victims were from Peru, Ecuador and Colombia. During his arrest, he confessed to 103 murders, but his connection with 300 similar crimes was discovered. In 1980, the Monster of the Andes Mountain was going through a difficult period of interrogation. During this period, he showed the graves of 53 victims to the police. Most of his victims were young girls who were between 9 and 12 years old. He was transferred to a psychiatric hospital, but in disbelief, he was released from there in 1998. But he was arrested again in 2002 for committing similar murders. Luis Garavito. Luis Garavito is one of the worst serial killers in the world who killed 138 people in a period of 5 years. Luis Garavito was accused of 300 murders. Due to the wide range of his crimes, the media gave him the nickname of the Beast. Luis Garavito used to torture his victims and then kill them. In order to cooperate with the police after his arrest, this strange and ruthless killer asked them for a map and showed them where his victims were buried. He, who himself was the victim of his father's rape, approached the victims and offered them a gift like chocolate. Then he starts walking with the victim and finally drags them to a secluded place. After cutting the victim's throat, he would cut them into pieces and bury them somewhere. Well, this list is so long that it is not possible to mention all of them, unfortunately. But I promise that there will be more of them in the future.